Hey folks, let's talk about power and capacitors. On the surface, these things are pretty simple, but there are some complex implications here for getting the most out of your ship, especially when fitting and piloting it for combat. So let's get into it. Every ship in Star Citizen needs power to function, and that's provided by the power plant. This is a pretty black and white thing since there's no benefit to not fully powering your components. They'll either have enough power and they'll work just fine, or they won't have enough power and they'll give diminished performance or just be completely unusable. Whenever you're planning the fit for your ship, you'll want to make sure that you have more than enough power, keeping in mind you'll need a little bit of extra for the quantum drive since that's not included in the Urkel calculation. You can also go into your power MFD and actually overclock your power supply to get a bit more power if you're underpowered, but you also need to remember to do that every time, so it's better just to get a strong enough power plant to begin with. Fortunately, most ships come with plenty of power, so you usually don't need to worry about this unless your ship only comes with a single stealth or competition grade power plant by default. Every ship in Star Citizen also has a capacitor, which is a system you can use to dynamically move power around between the weapons, engines, and shields on the fly. You interact with the capacitor via the power triangle on the power MFD in your ship. You can see that by default the capacitor is split three ways between the weapons, engines, and shields. You can click and drag on this to move it around, but that's a really cumbersome way to do it in mid-combat, so you can also use hotkeys to move it around. The F5, F6, and F7 keys will move the capacitor priority to weapons, engines, and shields respectively, and F8 will reset them to an even split. I prefer to remap them to the 1, 2, and 3 keys if I'm using a mouse and keyboard, and I like to just max a power system in a single tap, which is more convenient mid-combat. When a system has more capacitor priority than the default, it'll gain a bonus and recharge that system faster. Shields will gain up to 25% damage resistance and recharge their hit points faster, and engines will let you boost up to 25% longer and recharge the boost gauge quicker, and weapons will gain up to 20% larger magazine for energy ammo and recharge the energy ammo faster. And any systems that have capacitor set to 0 will still work just fine and keep whatever ammo, boost, or shields that they've already charged because the systems are still powered. They'll just recharge very slowly until you give them more capacitor priority. So this is why I prefer to go into combat with max capacitor to weapons, and I only put it on shields or thrusters if I need to recharge one of those systems. One last thing to note is that people will often use the terms cap, capacitor, power, and power triangle interchangeably, so if people are talking about moving power around, they're referring to capacitor management. Now let's go into a bit more detail about how each system interacts with the capacitor, starting with shields. Shields regenerate HP based on which shield you're using and what percentage of full power that the shield currently has on the power triangle. Grade A shields have the best regeneration rates with the highest shield HP, so those are the ones that you want. The regeneration rate is roughly proportional to how much of the capacitor power is set to shields. So for example, you'll have about half the max recharge rate if you have 50% of the power to shields. One thing to note is that shields will only regenerate if they haven't been hit for 5 seconds, and that applies regardless of capacitor priority. So it doesn't matter if you have 100% of the power to shields or 0%, you won't regen any shield HP for 5 seconds after getting hit. This is why I think it's good combat practice to only set the power to shields when you've disengaged from the enemy so that you don't waste any capacitor there while you're actively dogfighting and getting hit. While it's true you'll get somewhere between 0 and 25% damage resistance for your shields if you keep the shield cap priority over 33%, I don't think it's worth the price you pay in energy ammo recharge rate unless you're using Ballistix, or using a ship that has very deep ammo reserves that don't need to recharge often. The thruster boost regen is also based on how much of your capacitor is set to engines, and it'll fill about 3 times faster at 100% engines versus the default 33%. Just like shields, it'll still regenerate slowly even if none of the capacitor is set to engines. And it also has a short cooldown period before it starts recharging, which you can see next to the boost gauge right after you stop boosting. Because of this, longer boost sessions are more efficient since you'll waste less time in that cooldown period. I also did some testing to determine whether we get additional boost when the power is set to engines and discovered that we do. We can boost for about 25% longer with a full boost gauge when the capacitor is set to full engines, compared to 0 or 33% engines. So that's definitely what you want to do when you're covering longer distances. And I've tried this for a few different sizes of ships, so I think that's universal. One important clarification I want to make is that the amount of capacitor that you put to engines doesn't change your thrust output, so it doesn't affect your maneuvering capability or your max speed. It only affects the amount of boost and how fast you can recharge it. The weapon system is where things get more complicated. Ballistic weapons don't need weapon capacitors since they only need to be powered by the power plant and then they're good to go, but they have limited ammo that'll need to be restocked when they run out. Energy weapons like lasers and distortion use capacitor to recharge their ammo. The more capacitor that you have allocated to the weapon systems, the faster your energy ammo will recharge. I've done a bunch of testing across various ships with different size capacitors and seen that the recharge rate scales almost linearly with the weapon capacitor amount, which means that you'll get almost 3 times the ammo recharge by putting your weapons to 100% capacitor instead of the default 33. I'll put a link to the spreadsheets in the description for anyone that wants to take a look. And if you have your weapon capacitor set to more than the default 33%, you'll actually get a boost to your max energy ammo magazine, which will let you hold up to 20% more energy ammo in the guns when the capacitor is set to max weapons. All ships in the verse have 2 properties that define their weapon capacitor: the regen pool size and the fill rate. The regen pool size just says how much ammo your energy weapons can hold in the magazine, and the fill rate says how quickly the ship refills its magazines while not shooting. A larger regen pool means the ship can hold more total ammo in the energy weapon magazines, and this is actually a defining characteristic that separates different classes of ships. Pretty much all light fighters have a regen pool size of 4,500, medium fighters have 5,500, and most heavy fighters have 10k. Snub ships and smaller non-combat focused ships have 3,500 or less, whereas some industrial ships like the Caterpillar and the Starfarer get 15k. What all of these ships have in common though is that they have the same capacitor fill rate of 3,000. That means even though a heavy fighter with a 10k regen pool can hold more than twice as much energy ammo in its magazine as a light fighter with 4.5k, it'll take more than twice as long to recharge those magazines since they recharge at the same rate. This is why sustained DPS is a much better measure of a ship's actual DPS than burst DPS, since it counts ammo recharge cycles in its DPS calculation. So if you've ever had to recharge ammo in a fight, you're into sustained DPS territory. One way that you can limit your recharging is to go with a hybrid energy plus ballistic weapon setup. Since your capacitor regen pool is split across all your energy weapons, if you have fewer energy weapons, you can put more ammo in each weapon magazine. This gives you a much higher sustained DPS because ballistic weapons do more damage to begin with. Plus now your remaining energy weapons will have to recharge less frequently since they have more ammo in their magazines, which allows them to spend a larger percentage of time firing. There's a short cooldown every time you stop firing before your weapons recharge, and that's just wasted time when you're not applying DPS or recharging ammo, so the fewer times you need to wait for that cooldown, the higher your overall DPS will be, and larger ammo magazines minimize that. The downside of the hybrid setup is that you'll need to restock the ballistics at some point, so I only really do this with ballistic cannons since they can fire longer than repeaters. There are some ships though which have a 15k fill rate, which is 5 times the ammo regen of most other ships. These are the Constellations, the Hercules Starlifters, the 600i, and the Ares Ion. These ships also have a 45k capacitor regen pool, so they all have a really big energy ammo pool and a really high energy ammo recharge rate, which enables them to output their ludicrous levels of sustained DPS. Sometimes I'll even fight with these ships with the capacitor set to full shields for extra tankiness since you don't always need to recharge your ammo before you finish a fight. In doing all my testing, I also learned something really interesting, which is that almost all laser weapons of the same type have equal capacitor efficiency. What that means is that for a given regen pool size on a ship, that pool is worth the same amount of laser damage no matter what size weapons you fit on the ship. So if you take a Gladius for example with a 4500 regen pool size and an arrow with the same 4500 regen pool size, they'll do the same damage when they dump a full magazine of energy ammo as long as they're both using repeaters or they're both using cannons. It doesn't matter that the Gladius has 3 size 3 hardpoints and that the arrow has 2 size 3s and 2 size 1s. And it doesn't even matter if you went with a gimbaled weapon setup on the arrow with 2 size 2s and 2 size 1s. All of those repeater setups on both ships will do the same total damage of about 5500 with the capacitor set to full weapons. and cannons are twice as capacitor efficient, so they'll do about double that damage in a full energy magazine for all ships with a regen pool size of 4500. So the takeaway is that a given weapon size isn't more capacitor efficient than another, since they'll take the same size regen pool and turn it into the same amount of damage. The way that ships with the same regen pool size achieve different sustained DPS is that larger sizes of weapons burn through their allotted capacitor faster, which gives them a higher burst and sustained DPS since they're outputting that 5500 damage per magazine faster. That's also why ships with more guns will do more damage than ships with fewer guns, because more guns will eat through the ship's capacitor faster than fewer guns and do that 5500 damage over a shorter amount of time. This capacitor energy to damage relationship is true across repeaters and cannons from size 1 through size 5. This is one of the reasons why gimbaling your weapons can be a really useful tool, since downsizing the weapons to add gimbals is often not a large impact on your sustained DPS, since the smaller size weapons will still be outputting the same damage per full energy magazine, just a bit slower. I still wouldn't recommend gimbaling size 5 weapon hardpoints though, since the burst DPS of a size 5 laser cannon is almost 3 times higher than a size 4. So it's able to significantly raise the sustained DPS of the ship overall with that. Alright, I know that got a little bit dense near the end, but I hope you got a few takeaways. Like, it's really worthwhile to max your weapon capacitor while dogfighting, gimbals can be a really useful tool, and that sustained DPS is a really good way to measure your ship's effectiveness in most situations, since a ship's capacitor governs so much about how it fights. I also want to give a big thanks to the guy behind the DPS calculator at Urkel.games for creating an awesome free tool that's enabled me to learn some important information about ships that's not available in the game. I'm not affiliated with him in any way, but I recommend everyone check it out because it's the best companion tool to Star Citizen in my opinion. Anyway, that's all for capacitors and power, folks. I hope you've liked this video. Cheers.